The morning of July 4th, 1826, rose over the United States with the soft brilliance of a summer promise. Towns along the eastern coast prepared for a celebration, unlike any they had known before. 50 years had passed since a group of uncertain colonies declared themselves free. Church bells waited in silent towers. Musicians tuned their instruments. Children carried small flags through dusty streets. Across the young republic, people gathered to honor a nation that had survived long enough to begin believing in its own future. Yet in Quincy, Massachusetts, far from the crowds and speeches, another kind of history was unfolding. Inside a modest farmhouse, an old man lay in an upstairs room where the curtains weakened the sunlight into pale bands across the floor. The air seemed unusually still. Family members moved carefully around the bed, speaking in low voices. John Adams, the second President of the United States, was nearing the end of a life that had carried him from rocky farmland to the highest office in the nation. His breathing came slowly now, each breath separated by a silence that seemed to grow longer. Age had reduced the forceful statesman to a fragile figure beneath simple blankets. His face, once full of restless energy and argument, had softened into exhaustion. His hands rested motionless near his chest. Those hands had written letters across oceans, signed decisions that shaped governments, and defended principles that often cost him friendship and popularity. Now they no longer held a pen. They simply waited with the rest of him. Outside, the country was preparing to celebrate what men like him had made possible. Bells would ring, cannons would fire, families would gather beneath bright skies and speak proudly of liberty. Yet almost no one knew that one of the last great witnesses to the revolution was quietly slipping away. There was something almost unbearably poetic in the contrast. A nation was growing louder with joy, while one of its oldest voices was becoming softer. History was celebrating itself outside while memory was fading inside a darkened room. Before we continue, consider subscribing to the channel and joining us for more stories told with calmness, depth, and cinematic emotion. Your support helps. These forgotten moments return to life, one human story at a time. John Adams had been drifting between sleep and wakefulness for several hours. At moments his eyes opened and seemed to search for something beyond the walls. Perhaps memory had carried him back to Philadelphia, where men once whispered about independence, as though speaking too loudly might invite the gallows. Perhaps he could hear old debates echoing in his mind. Perhaps he saw Abigail again. No one could know. The people beside him could only wait and wonder what kind of world remained inside a man at the edge of death. Then, near midday, the old man seemed to gather what little strength remained. His eyes opened more clearly. His lips moved. Those closest to the bed leaned forward, afraid they might miss his final words. After a pause, he spoke the name of the man who had been his friend, his rival, his political enemy, and finally his friend again. Thomas Jefferson survives. The sentence was quiet, but it carried the weight of half a century of affection, resentment, competition, pride, and reconciliation. For John Adams, the thought that Jefferson still lived may have offered comfort. Perhaps it meant that some part of their shared revolution would remain after he was gone. Perhaps he imagined his old companion waking that morning beneath the Virginia sun, still thinking, still writing, still reflecting on the strange nation they had helped create. Yet Adams did not know that several hundred kilometers away, at Monticello, Thomas Jefferson had died only hours earlier. The friend he believed alive had already crossed the same invisible threshold. When the news spread, people across the nation struggled to believe it. Two of the most important figures of American independence had died on the same day. Not an ordinary day, but exactly 50 years after the Declaration of Independence was adopted. The coincidence seemed too precise, too symbolic, too perfectly shaped to belong to real life. It felt like something arranged by a novelist or imagined by a poet. One man had helped write the Declaration. The other had helped persuade a hesitant Congress to accept it. Neither knew that the other was dying. Neither could witness the strange symmetry of their final hours. Yet history connected them once more, not through debate, politics, or letters, but through silence. There are moments when the past seems almost conscious, as though events gather around certain dates and create meaning beyond human intention. July 4th, 1826 became one of those moments. The nation celebrated its survival while losing two men who had risked everything at the beginning. But the beauty of that coincidence should not hide the more difficult truth of John Adams himself. He was never a simple hero. He could be proud, impatient, suspicious, and painfully blunt. He often knew he was right, and he sometimes seemed determined to make everyone else suffer for being slower to understand it. He was not gifted with effortless charm. He did not float through rooms like Benjamin Franklin. He did not possess the polished elegance of Thomas Jefferson. Adams arrived with heat, urgency, and argument. Many people admired him. Many others found him exhausting. He had the unusual ability to make allies feel challenged and opponents feel insulted, sometimes within the same conversation. Yet beneath his difficult manner was a powerful conviction that duty mattered more than comfort. He believed public service was not supposed to make a person loved. It was supposed to make a person useful. That belief would guide him through some of the greatest decisions of his life, and it would also leave him lonely more often than he expected. His presidency ended in defeat. Political enemies mocked him. Newspapers attacked his character, his judgment, even his appearance. Former allies abandoned him. For years it seemed possible that history might remember his failures more clearly than his sacrifices. Imagine living long enough to see strangers reduce your entire life to a few unpopular decisions. Imagine giving decades to a country that seemed unable to decide whether you had protected it or betrayed it. John Adams carried that uncertainty into retirement, along with wounds that never fully disappeared. And yet time did something politics could not. It softened the anger. Old enemies began writing again. The Republic survived. Elections continued. Power changed hands without civil war. John Adams lived long enough to watch the nation grow beyond the men who had created it. Perhaps that was his deepest reward. The United States no longer depended on his presence. The constitutional system continued without asking his permission. The experiment had become larger than the founders themselves, which was exactly what they had once hoped would happen. As the afternoon moved slowly toward evening, the celebration outside grew louder. Bells rang across towns. Voices rose in song. Families raised glasses to the past and made promises about the future. Inside the farmhouse, John Adams grew quieter. The contrast seemed almost like a final scene arranged for the stage. Beyond the walls, a young nation announced itself to the world. Within them, an old man released his final breath. At approximately 6:20 in the evening, the life of John Adams came to an end. He had been born before the United States existed. He had watched it move from rumor to rebellion, from rebellion to war, from war to fragile independence, and from independence to government. He had seen fear become law, argument become institutions, and impossible ideas become ordinary facts. Now he departed on the exact anniversary of the document that had defined his public life. The timing made his death unforgettable, but it did not explain how such a life had begun. For that, we must leave the bedroom and travel backward. We must return to a small farming community in colonial Massachusetts, to a world of narrow roads, dark winters, stone walls, stubborn soil, and daily labor. We must look beyond the president and find the boy. Before John Adams argued before Congress, he argued with his father. Before he crossed oceans, he crossed muddy fields. Before he defended liberty, he learned discipline from weather, work, family, and failure. Greatness did not arrive suddenly. It was built quietly, long before anyone thought history was watching. The place where John Adams entered the world could hardly have seemed less likely to produce a man whose name would become woven into the story of a nation. Braintree, Massachusetts, was not a center of wealth or influence. It was a farming community shaped by stubborn earth, cold winters, and people who measured success by honest labor rather than public recognition. Life followed the rhythm of the seasons. Every sunrise brought work. Every harvest demanded endurance. Survival itself was considered a quiet achievement, and ambition rarely reached beyond the boundaries of neighboring villages. His father, also named John Adams, was a farmer, a shoemaker, and a respected member of the local church. He never possessed great wealth, yet he carried something his children would remember far longer than money. He believed that character mattered more than comfort. Promises were meant to be kept even when no one was watching. Work deserved to be finished, even when exhaustion settled into the bones. Faith was not spoken through grand speeches, but demonstrated through ordinary habits repeated faithfully every single day. His mother, Susanna Boylston Adams, brought another kind of strength into the household. She possessed intelligence, quiet determination, and deep religious conviction. While the father taught discipline through labor, the mother nurtured curiosity through patience and conversation. Together they created a home where education was valued, honesty expected, and personal responsibility treated as something sacred. No one inside that modest wooden house imagined their eldest son would someday stand among the architects of a new republic. Yet the foundation for that future was already being laid. Childhood in colonial New England demanded maturity much earlier than modern life ever asks of young people. There were no idle mornings stretching lazily into the afternoon. Boys learned to carry water, split firewood, tend animals, repair fences, and help cultivate fields almost as soon as they were strong enough to lift simple tools. Every pair of hands mattered because every season carried uncertainty. A poor harvest, a harsh winter, or an illness could threaten an entire family's survival before another spring arrived. John did not grow up surrounded by luxury or comfort. Instead, he grew up surrounded by responsibility. The narrow dirt roads, weathered barns, rough stone walls, and endless fields became his earliest classroom. They taught lessons that could never be found inside books alone. Patience came from planting seeds without immediate reward. Resilience came from rebuilding after storms destroyed weeks of careful work. Humility came from recognizing that nature answered to no human ambition. These quiet experiences settled deep inside him long before politics ever entered his imagination. Yet despite the discipline of rural life, young John was not the perfectly obedient child later generations might expect. He could be restless, stubborn, and easily distracted. When lessons became difficult, his attention wandered toward open fields rather than school books. He preferred exploring forests, watching birds, or wandering country paths to memorizing Latin grammar inside a classroom. There were days when education felt more like punishment than opportunity. If anyone had predicted during those years that he would become one of the most educated men in America, few neighbors would have believed it. His father noticed this growing indifference with increasing concern. Education required sacrifice. Books cost money. Sending a son to school meant losing another worker on the farm. If John refused to value the opportunity, perhaps he needed to understand what life without learning truly looked like. Rather than delivering an angry lecture, the elder Adams chose something far more memorable. One morning he brought his son into the fields and assigned him the exhausting labor performed every day by ordinary farmers. The work began before sunrise and continued beneath an unforgiving sky. Heavy tools bruised his hands. Damp soil clung to his boots. Every task demanded strength, patience, and repetition. Hour after hour, the fields seemed endless. By evening, fatigue settled into every muscle. Young John returned home completely exhausted. The next morning, the same work waited again, unchanged and equally demanding. There was nothing glamorous about honest labor, only the certainty that tomorrow would ask for the same effort all over again. After several days, his father finally asked a simple question. Would you rather spend your life behind a plow or behind a book? There was no anger in the question, only quiet honesty. The lesson was not meant to shame farming. His father respected farming deeply because it had sustained generations of their family. Instead, he wanted his son to recognize that education opened doors unavailable to most people. Knowledge offered choices. Ignorance narrowed them. That realization settled into the young boy's heart more deeply than any punishment ever could. From that moment, something gradually changed. John did not suddenly become a perfect student, but curiosity slowly replaced reluctance. The books no longer appeared to be burdens placed upon him by adults. They became windows leading toward worlds he had never imagined. History introduced him to civilizations separated by centuries. Philosophy invited questions that ordinary conversation rarely explored. Language revealed that ideas could travel farther than armies. Each new lesson widened the horizon, beyond the small farming village where he had spent his earliest years. Still, transformation never happens all at once. There were moments when old habits returned and discouragement whispered that learning remained too difficult. What separated John from many others was not extraordinary talent but growing persistence. Each setback became another reason to continue, rather than another excuse to quit. This pattern would define his entire life. Whether studying law, defending unpopular clients, negotiating with foreign governments, or leading a divided nation, determination repeatedly proved stronger than natural brilliance. As his education advanced, teachers began recognizing qualities that had once remained hidden beneath youthful stubbornness. He possessed an unusually disciplined mind. Whenever a subject genuinely captured his attention, he questioned accepted ideas instead of memorizing them blindly. He preferred understanding principles rather than collecting facts. Sometimes this habit frustrated instructors because he challenged assumptions that other students quietly accepted, yet the same habit would later allow him to stand against public opinion whenever conscience demanded it. The intellectual world opening before him also introduced an important tension that would remain throughout his life. He deeply respected tradition, faith, and inherited wisdom. Yet he refused to accept authority merely because it claimed authority. He believed every important question deserved careful examination. Truth, in his view, became stronger when tested rather than weaker. This balance between respect and independence shaped not only his education but eventually his politics, his legal career, and even his friendships. Years later, many people would admire John Adams for his courage in confronting kings, political opponents, and hostile crowds. Few realized that the earliest version of that courage appeared inside a simple classroom where a determined student refused to stop asking difficult questions. Courage often begins quietly. It rarely announces itself with dramatic speeches. Sometimes it begins when a young mind decides that understanding matters more than approval. Long before John challenged an empire, he learned to challenge easy answers. His growing reputation eventually carried him toward Harvard College, one of the most respected centers of learning in the colonies. For a farm boy from Braintree, admission represented something extraordinary. The journey itself symbolized far more than physical distance. It marked the crossing from a world defined almost entirely by manual labor into another shaped by books, debate, philosophy, and public life. Every mile separating the family farm from Cambridge also carried him farther away from the future his father had once expected. When John first arrived, excitement mixed naturally with uncertainty. Harvard gathered some of the brightest young minds in colonial America, many from families wealthier and more influential than his own. He was intelligent, yet he also understood how much remained unknown. Classrooms demanded discipline beyond anything he had experienced before. Professors expected rigorous thought rather than simple repetition. Conversations among students stretched late into the evening, exploring religion, science, history, government, and human nature with an intensity that fascinated him. Without realizing it, the young man who had once resisted school had entered an environment where ideas would become the center of his existence. The transformation was far from complete. Many failures, disappointments, and unexpected turns still waited ahead. Yet somewhere between the quiet fields of Braintree and the halls of Harvard, John Adams had already begun becoming someone entirely different from the restless boy who once dreamed only of escaping the classroom. History had not called his name yet, but it had already begun preparing him for the moment when it finally would. Graduating from Harvard did not immediately answer the question that troubled John Adams more than any examination ever had. He possessed an education that many young men could only dream of, yet he remained uncertain about the direction of his own life. Ambition stirred quietly within him, but ambition alone could not reveal its destination. The world beyond the college walls offered countless possibilities, and each seemed wrapped in equal measures of promise and uncertainty. For the first time, he discovered that earning knowledge was often easier than deciding what to do with it. Like many graduates of his generation, John accepted work as a school teacher. The position offered respectability, a modest income, and the chance to contribute to his community. On paper, it seemed like a sensible beginning. Every morning he entered the classroom, carrying books beneath his arm and lessons carefully prepared the night before. Young students filled wooden benches, their curious faces waiting for guidance. From the outside, nothing appeared unusual. Many believed he had found a stable profession that could comfortably support him for the rest of his life. Inside, however, a quiet dissatisfaction continued growing. Teaching demanded patience, discipline, and responsibility, qualities John certainly possessed, yet something remained missing. Each day followed nearly the same pattern. Lessons began, lessons ended. Weeks blended into months with surprising speed. Although he cared about his students, he increasingly sensed that his own mind was reaching toward questions larger than the classroom could satisfy. It was not that he disliked education. Rather, he felt as though his education itself was urging him toward a different calling that had not yet revealed its name. During evenings, after the day's lessons had ended and silence settled over the village, John often sat alone with books spread across his desk. Candles burned late into the night while he read history, philosophy, literature, and law. These private hours gradually became the most meaningful part of each day. While teaching provided employment, reading awakened purpose. The great thinkers of England, Rome, and ancient Greece became companions in long conversations that stretched across centuries. Each page seemed to ask questions that refused to leave his mind once the book had closed. He also began keeping detailed journals, recording thoughts that he shared with almost no one else. These pages reveal a young man remarkably honest with himself. He admitted his fears, questioned his abilities, criticized his own weaknesses, and wondered repeatedly whether he was wasting the years that should shape the rest of his life. Reading those reflections today feels surprisingly modern. Despite living in the 18th century, John wrestled with doubts familiar to countless people today. He worried about choosing the wrong path. He feared becoming ordinary, despite longing to accomplish something meaningful. There is a quiet loneliness that often accompanies people standing at the beginning of important journeys. From the outside, everything appears stable. They have work, they have education, they have opportunity. Yet inside, they carry the uncomfortable feeling that their true destination still lies somewhere beyond the horizon. John experienced exactly that uncertainty. Rather than pretending confidence, he allowed himself to confront the discomfort honestly. In doing so, he demonstrated a kind of courage rarely celebrated by history, the courage to admit that success without purpose can still feel strangely empty. The turning point arrived not through dramatic revelation but through gradual realization. The more John studied legal philosophy, the more deeply he became fascinated by the relationship between justice and society. Laws, he discovered, were not merely collections of rules. They reflected the values people chose to protect. They determined how power was exercised, how conflicts were resolved, and whether ordinary citizens could trust those who governed them. Unlike teaching, The study of law seemed connected directly to the larger questions that had quietly occupied his thoughts for years. Once he recognized that attraction, his decision became almost inevitable. He would pursue the law. The choice carried considerable risk. Becoming a lawyer demanded years of difficult study, financial sacrifice, and uncertain reward. There were no guarantees of success. Many talented students failed before ever establishing meaningful practices. Nevertheless, John accepted the uncertainty, because uncertainty accompanied every worthwhile ambition. Remaining comfortable inside a profession that no longer inspired him suddenly appeared far more frightening than beginning again. Instead of attending a formal law school, as modern students might expect, he entered the traditional apprenticeship system. Aspiring lawyers learned directly under experienced attorneys, reading legal texts, observing court proceedings, drafting documents, and slowly mastering the practical realities of the profession. John found himself immersed in an entirely different intellectual world. Every case carried moral complexity. Every argument demanded careful reasoning. Every decision possessed consequences, extending far beyond theoretical discussion. The law challenged not only memory, but judgment, discipline, and character. His mentor expected excellence rather than excuses. Long hours disappeared beneath towering stacks of legal volumes. Precedents had to be understood in precise detail. Arguments required logical structure, capable of surviving relentless criticism. Mistakes received immediate correction. The work often felt exhausting. Yet, unlike his earlier dissatisfaction as a teacher, this exhaustion brought quiet satisfaction. For the first time, effort and purpose seemed perfectly aligned. Difficult days no longer raised questions about whether he belonged there. They simply reminded him how much remained to be learned. John approached legal study with extraordinary seriousness because he believed justice depended upon preparation. A careless lawyer endangered more than personal reputation. Careless reasoning could destroy livelihoods, families, or even innocent lives. This conviction distinguished him from individuals who viewed law merely as a path toward wealth or social prestige. He respected the profession because he believed it carried profound responsibility. Words spoken inside a courtroom possessed real consequences beyond intellectual debate. Therefore, every argument deserved honesty, precision, and careful thought. As months passed, confidence gradually replaced uncertainty, not the loud confidence born from arrogance, but the quiet confidence earned through disciplined practice. He discovered that persistence often defeated natural brilliance. Many students began enthusiastically before surrendering when progress slowed. John simply continued reading, writing, questioning, and improving one day after another. The habit of steady effort, first learned while working the family farm, now became one of his greatest intellectual strengths. Without fully realizing it, childhood discipline had quietly prepared him for professional excellence. Even so, success did not arrive overnight. After beginning his legal career, clients appeared only occasionally. There were weeks when little work entered his office. Income remained uncertain, and moments of discouragement returned. Every ambitious young lawyer dreams of crowded waiting rooms and important cases. Reality often offers empty chairs, unpaid bills, and long afternoons spent hoping someone might walk through the door. John experienced those disappointments firsthand. They tested not only his patience but his belief that he had chosen the right path. Rather than surrendering to frustration, he transformed quiet periods into opportunities for further growth. While waiting for clients, he continued studying legal history, refining written arguments, and observing experienced attorneys whenever possible. Every slow season became another classroom. Every disappointment became another lesson in endurance. Years later, when people admired his remarkable command of constitutional principles and political philosophy, few understood that much of that knowledge had been accumulated during lonely hours when professional success still seemed frustratingly distant. Looking back, it becomes clear that these uncertain years shaped John Adams, just as profoundly as the famous events that would later define his public reputation. Had immediate success arrived easily, he might never have developed the resilience that distinguished him throughout every political storm. Adversity forced patience. Patience strengthened character. Character prepared him for responsibilities far greater than he could yet imagine. History often celebrates spectacular victories while overlooking the quiet seasons during which remarkable people patiently become capable of achieving them. By the time his legal practice slowly began attracting greater attention, something important had already changed inside him. He no longer sought achievement merely to satisfy personal ambition. He had begun understanding that the law offered something larger than professional advancement. It provided an opportunity to defend fairness even when fairness proved unpopular. That principle would soon confront him with decisions capable of transforming both his career and the future of an entire nation. Before long, John Adams would discover that true integrity often demands standing beside justice precisely when public opinion insists that justice should be ignored. As the years passed, the young attorney who had once waited anxiously for clients slowly earned a reputation that could not be purchased with wealth or inherited through family connections. People did not seek John Adams because he promised easy victories. They came because they believed he would tell them the truth, even when the truth was uncomfortable. His arguments were carefully prepared, his reasoning was disciplined, and his respect for the law never depended upon whether a case was popular. Little by little, his name began traveling beyond the small communities where he had first opened his practice. Unlike many ambitious lawyers, John refused to treat the courtroom as a stage built only for personal glory. Every case represented real people carrying real fears. Farmers worried about losing their land. Merchants feared financial ruin. Families struggled through bitter disputes that threatened to divide generations. John listened carefully before speaking. He understood that the law existed not simply to reward cleverness but to protect fairness whenever possible. This habit of careful listening would later become one of the qualities that distinguished him in political life as well. His growing success did not make life easier in every respect. Legal work demanded long hours, endless reading, and constant travel across rough colonial roads. Journeys that modern travelers complete comfortably within a short drive often required entire days on horseback through rain, snow, mud, and bitter cold. Many evenings ended inside modest inns where the food was simple and the beds offered little comfort. Yet, John rarely complained. Hardship had accompanied him since childhood. Inconvenience simply became another ordinary companion rather than an obstacle worth fearing. During these years, another chapter quietly entered his life, one that would influence him more deeply than any courtroom victory ever could. While visiting the home of a local minister, John met a young woman named Abigail Smith. Their first conversations did not resemble scenes from romantic novels. There were no dramatic declarations or instant promises. Instead, they spoke about books, faith, politics, family, and the responsibilities people owed to society. What began as ordinary conversation gradually revealed an extraordinary meeting of minds. Abigail possessed an intelligence that surprised many people who underestimated women of her generation. Although denied the formal education available to men, she had educated herself through relentless reading and thoughtful observation. She understood history, appreciated literature, and formed opinions with remarkable independence. John quickly realized he had encountered someone who challenged his thinking rather than simply agreeing with it. Their conversations became longer, richer, and more personal. Admiration slowly deepened into affection, not through dramatic gestures but through mutual respect. The letters they exchanged during courtship remain among the most beautiful collections of personal correspondence in early American history. Reading them today reveals two individuals who loved not only each other but also ideas. They discussed hopes, disappointments, faith, loneliness, and the uncertain future waiting before them. There was tenderness in their words, but there was also honesty. Neither attempted to create an illusion of perfection. They shared doubts as willingly as dreams. building a relationship grounded in trust rather than appearance. For John, these letters became more than expressions of affection. They became a place where he could remove the public mask required by professional life. In court, he argued with confidence. In private correspondence, he admitted uncertainty. He spoke openly about frustration, ambition, fear, and exhaustion. Abigail never mocked those confessions. Instead, she answered with encouragement balanced by practical wisdom. She admired her future husband, but she never worshipped him. She understood both his strengths and his stubborn flaws, accepting the whole man rather than an imagined hero. Their marriage marked the beginning of one of the most remarkable partnerships in American history. Unlike many political marriages built around appearances, theirs rested upon genuine friendship. John often spent long periods traveling for legal work or public service, leaving Abigail to manage the household, raise children, oversee finances, and solve countless practical problems alone. She accomplished those responsibilities with quiet determination, while continuing to advise her husband through letters that often displayed sharper political insight than many public officials possessed. Years later, John would openly admit that whatever success history credited to him belonged equally to Abigail. Her influence reached far beyond emotional support. She challenged his assumptions, questioned his conclusions, and reminded him of ordinary people whenever politics threatened to become too abstract. When disappointment overwhelmed him, her words restored perspective. When success tempted pride, she quietly returned his attention to duty. Together, they formed a partnership in which affection and intellect strengthened one another rather than competing for attention. While his personal life grew richer, the political atmosphere surrounding the colonies became increasingly unsettled. Tensions between Great Britain and its American colonies had existed for years, yet many people still believed compromise would eventually restore harmony. New taxes, stricter regulations, and expanding parliamentary authority stirred resentment throughout New England. Taverns, churches, marketplaces, and private homes became places where ordinary citizens debated questions that once belonged only to distant politicians. Something important was changing. Although few could yet predict where it would lead, John observed these developments with growing concern. Unlike passionate radicals who demanded immediate confrontation, he approached political conflict with caution. He respected law deeply enough to understand that disorder carried terrible consequences. At the same time, he believed government existed to protect liberty rather than diminish it. Balancing those convictions required careful thought. He refused to embrace anger simply because others did. Every argument deserved evidence. Every accusation required proof. Every proposed solution needed to survive serious examination before earning his support. Through newspaper essays and private discussions, John gradually entered the expanding political conversation. His writing displayed the same qualities that had made him a respected lawyer. He built arguments patiently, relying upon reason instead of emotional outbursts. Readers noticed that he criticized policies rather than attacking personalities. Although deeply concerned by British actions, he remained committed to justice, even when justice demanded restraint instead of outrage. This balanced approach earned admiration from thoughtful observers while frustrating those who preferred louder voices and quicker conclusions. Without realizing it, John Adams was moving steadily toward the center of events that would soon reshape the entire British Empire. His legal reputation had opened doors into public life. His marriage had given him an intellectual companion, capable of strengthening every important decision. His writings had introduced him to political leaders across the colonies. Each step seemed almost ordinary when viewed alone. Together, however, they formed the path leading directly toward one of the most difficult moral choices of his entire career. That choice arrived unexpectedly on a cold evening in Boston. Gunfire echoed through crowded streets. Confusion spread rapidly. Frightened civilians shouted accusations while British soldiers struggled to maintain order amid rising panic. By the time silence returned, Several colonists lay dead or dying upon the frozen ground. Within hours, rumors traveled faster than facts. Anger swept across Massachusetts. Many people no longer wanted careful investigation. They wanted immediate punishment. Grief had already begun transforming into outrage, and outrage rarely waits patiently for evidence. Few moments test personal integrity more severely than those in which public opinion has already reached its verdict before the trial has even begun. John Adams could feel the pressures surrounding him. Neighbors demanded justice. Newspapers fueled indignation. Emotions rose with astonishing speed. Everyone seemed certain they already knew who deserved blame. Yet beneath the noise stood a quieter question that would soon confront him personally. Would the law remain faithful to its principles when defending those almost everyone already hated? Or would justice surrender to the passions of the crowd? That question was about to define not only John Adams as a lawyer, but also the character of the future nation he hoped one day might exist. News of the shooting spread through Boston with astonishing speed. Before sunrise, conversations filled taverns, marketplaces, churches, and private homes. Each retelling added new details, some accurate, many imagined. Fear quickly became anger, and anger soon hardened into certainty. People no longer spoke about an incident that required investigation. They spoke about a crime they believed had already been judged. The streets carried an atmosphere unlike anything John Adams had experienced before. Beneath every conversation lingered the unsettling feeling that something far larger than a single tragedy had begun. The men at the center of that storm were British soldiers. To many colonists, they represented more than individuals involved in a violent confrontation. They symbolized years of growing resentment toward imperial authority. Taxes, military occupation, political disputes, and wounded pride had created tensions that stretched far beyond one winter evening. Now those frustrations had found a visible target. Public outrage demanded swift punishment. Few people paused to ask whether justice could survive if emotion alone decided guilt before any evidence had been carefully examined. Then came a request that shocked nearly everyone who heard it. The British soldiers needed legal representation. No respected attorney wished to accept the case. Doing so promised little except criticism, suspicion, and perhaps permanent damage to one's reputation. Many lawyers quietly declined. Others feared retaliation from neighbors who already viewed the accused as murderers. Defending them seemed almost impossible. Anyone who accepted the responsibility risked being labeled an enemy of the very people whose rights they claimed to protect. John Adams understood exactly what accepting the case would cost him. He knew friends might question his loyalty. Clients could abandon his practice. Years of careful work building public trust might disappear almost overnight. He also understood something equally important. If even the most hated individuals could not receive a fair trial, then the colonies possessed no moral authority to criticize the injustice they believed Great Britain had committed against them. Principles carried value only when applied during the hardest moments. After careful reflection, John accepted the defense. The decision surprised supporters and opponents alike. Some viewed it as an act of courage, others condemned it as betrayal. Whispers followed him through the streets. Acquaintances who once greeted him warmly now looked away. Critics accused him of defending tyranny itself, yet John remained remarkably calm. He repeatedly explained that representing a client never meant approving of every action that client had taken. It meant protecting the integrity of the law, because justice without fairness eventually becomes nothing more than revenge. Preparing for the trial demanded extraordinary discipline. Emotions throughout Boston remained dangerously high. Witnesses remembered events differently. Rumors continued spreading faster than verified facts. John carefully examined testimony, compared conflicting accounts, and searched patiently for evidence capable of surviving careful scrutiny. He refused to build arguments upon speculation. Every statement required support. Every conclusion demanded reason. While many people outside the courtroom argued with passion, John prepared to argue with facts. believing truth deserved patience even when public anger demanded immediate satisfaction. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere remained tense from the opening moments. Spectators filled every available space, eager to witness proceedings that seemed destined to influence far more than the fate of several soldiers. Many expected dramatic confrontation. Instead, John spoke with measured confidence. He reminded jurors that justice could not depend upon popularity or prejudice. Evidence, not emotion, must guide their decision. His calm manner contrasted sharply with the anger that still echoed beyond the courthouse walls, making his words seem even more deliberate. One statement from his closing argument would survive long after the trial itself had faded into history. "Facts are stubborn things." With those simple words, John expressed an idea that reached beyond any individual case. Opinions may change, rumors may multiply, emotions may rise and fall. Facts remain unchanged. They refuse to bend before fear, political pressure, or public excitement. By placing evidence above passion, he appealed not merely to the jury's intellect but also to their conscience, asking them to protect justice itself rather than satisfy collective anger. The verdict surprised many observers. Several soldiers were acquitted because the evidence failed to prove murder beyond reasonable doubt. 2 others were convicted of the lesser offense of manslaughter. The decision pleased almost no one completely. Yet that very outcome suggested the legal process had functioned independently of public pressure. John Adams had not guaranteed victory for every defendant. Instead, he had helped ensure that judgment rested upon evidence rather than outrage. In doing so, he demonstrated the kind of legal integrity that would define his public reputation for the rest of his life. The weeks following the trial were difficult. Criticism continued. Some neighbors questioned whether he truly belonged among those defending colonial rights. Others quietly admitted, "The Tufaisidin." Over time, respect gradually replaced suspicion. People began recognizing that a lawyer willing to defend unpopular clients, according to principle, might also possess the courage to defend unpopular truths in political life. Paradoxically, the very case that threatened to destroy his reputation ultimately strengthened it. John himself later reflected that accepting the defense had been one of the finest actions of his career, not because it brought wealth or widespread praise, but because it proved that his commitment to justice remained stronger than his desire for approval. This distinction would become increasingly important as political tensions continued escalating. The colonies stood on the edge of transformation, and leaders motivated only by popularity would soon discover how fragile popularity could become during moments of national crisis. Outside the courtroom, conflict between Great Britain and the colonies continued intensifying. Each new law passed by Parliament deepened colonial frustration. Merchants protested economic restrictions. Newspapers criticized imperial policies with growing boldness. Public meetings attracted larger crowds than ever before. Conversations that once belonged to educated elites now unfolded among craftsmen, farmers, sailors, and shopkeepers. Ordinary people increasingly believed that questions about liberty belonged to everyone, not merely to governors and legislators. John watched these developments with careful attention. Unlike some fiery voices demanding immediate separation, he still hoped reason might prevent irreversible conflict. Independence remained an extraordinary idea, one carrying enormous risks alongside uncertain rewards. Breaking from the most powerful empire in the world would require courage beyond anything the colonies had yet demonstrated. Nevertheless, each passing month convinced him that reconciliation was becoming less likely. Trust, once damaged repeatedly, rarely returns unchanged. His legal work increasingly blended with political responsibility. Essays flowed from his pen defending colonial rights, while avoiding reckless extremism. Local leaders sought his advice because they recognized both his intellect and his steady judgment. Unlike speakers who stirred crowds through dramatic language, John persuaded through disciplined reasoning. He rarely shouted. He rarely exaggerated. Instead, he patiently built arguments brick by brick until listeners discovered they had arrived at conclusions almost naturally. It was a quieter form of leadership, yet often a more enduring one, without fully realizing it. John Adams had crossed an invisible line. He was no longer merely an attorney serving individual clients. He had become a public figure whose opinions carried influence across Massachusetts and beyond. Every speech, every article, and every legal decision drew increasing attention. History was slowly gathering around him. The life he had once imagined as a respected country lawyer was giving way to responsibilities that neither he nor anyone else could have predicted during those uncertain years after graduating from Harvard. Soon, letters would summon him away from familiar courtrooms and quiet country roads toward gatherings where representatives from different colonies struggled to imagine a shared future. There he would meet men whose names would later fill history books. Some would become trusted friends. Others would become determined rivals. Together they would face questions that no generation before them had ever answered. Could 13 divided colonies truly become one nation? And if they dared to try, what price would each of them be willing to pay? When John Adams accepted the invitation to attend the First Continental Congress, he understood that he was leaving behind far more than his legal practice. He was stepping into a gathering unlike anything the American colonies had ever attempted before. Delegates from distant provinces, each carrying different interests, traditions, economies, and personalities, would attempt to speak with one voice while still struggling to decide whether such a voice could truly exist. The journey itself felt symbolic. Narrow roads stretched through forests, villages, rivers, and fields, carrying him steadily toward a future no one could clearly imagine. Travel in the 18th century offered long hours for reflection. Riding on horseback through changing landscapes, John often found himself thinking less about politics than about responsibility. What right did any man have to influence the fate of millions yet unborn? What if the decisions waiting ahead led only to greater suffering? History often remembers bold declarations while forgetting the quiet uncertainty that precedes them. Before becoming a revolutionary, John remained simply a thoughtful lawyer wondering whether wisdom would prove equal to the enormous challenges approaching from every direction. When he finally arrived in Philadelphia, the city seemed alive with expectation. Carriages crowded the streets, inns filled with travelers. Conversations drifted from open windows late into the evening as delegates met one another for the first time. Every gathering carried an undercurrent of caution. Although they shared growing frustration toward British policies, agreement ended there. Some still believed reconciliation remained possible. Others quietly suspected that compromise had already slipped beyond reach. No one yet possessed a clear map showing where the road ahead would lead. John soon encountered remarkable men whose names would become inseparable from American history. There was George Washington, whose calm dignity attracted attention even before he spoke. Benjamin Franklin, older than many of the others, carried decades of experience wrapped inside effortless wit and quiet confidence. Patrick Henry possessed fiery passion capable of stirring entire rooms within moments. John Jay, Richard Henry Lee, Samuel Adams, and many others brought their own strengths, ambitions, and disagreements. Together they formed an extraordinary collection of minds, though hardly a harmonious one. Despite sharing common concerns, the delegates often disagreed sharply about methods, priorities, and timing. Every colony viewed events through its own experience. Merchants feared economic collapse. Farmers worried about survival. Lawyers debated constitutional rights. Political leaders argued over authority and representation. Discussions stretched for hours, sometimes ending without meaningful agreement. Compromise demanded patience, almost beyond imagination. The United States did not begin as a nation united in certainty. It began as 13 separate communities struggling to trust one another enough to face a common challenge. John Adams rarely dominated conversations through dramatic speeches. That role belonged naturally to others. Instead, he influenced meetings through relentless preparation, disciplined reasoning, and remarkable persistence, he listened carefully before speaking. When he finally rose to address fellow delegates, every argument rested upon careful thought rather than emotional excitement. Some colleagues considered him stubborn. Others admired his intellectual honesty. Even those who disagreed recognized that he believed every word he spoke. Conviction gave his voice a quiet authority impossible to imitate. During these early sessions, independence remained an idea. Many delegates hesitated even to mention publicly. Open separation from Great Britain appeared almost unimaginable. The British Empire remained one of the strongest political and military powers on earth. Declaring independence would almost certainly lead to war, economic hardship, and the possibility of complete destruction. Many hoped improved negotiations might still preserve peace. John understood those fears. He shared them. Yet, with every new report arriving from the colonies, he became increasingly convinced that peaceful reconciliation was slipping farther away. Letters from Abigail continued reaching him during these months, providing emotional strength whenever uncertainty threatened to overwhelm him. Separated by great distance, husband and wife maintained the habit that had defined their relationship from the beginning. They thought together even while living apart. John described political debates, personal frustrations, and growing concerns about the future. Abigail answered with encouragement balanced by remarkable insight. She reminded him that public duty should never erase private humanity. Her words became a quiet refuge amid endless meetings, speeches, and difficult decisions. As tensions continued rising, John gradually emerged as one of the strongest advocates for preparing the colonies to defend themselves. He did not seek conflict for its own sake. Rather, he believed people hoping to preserve peace must also prepare for the possibility that peace might fail. Many colleagues initially considered his warnings too severe. Nevertheless, events unfolding across Massachusetts soon began confirming his fears. Each confrontation between British authorities and colonial resistance made compromise appear less realistic than it had seemed only months earlier. Then came the battles of Lexington and Concord. News reached Philadelphia carrying both sorrow and determination. Blood had been spilled. The conflict that many desperately hoped to avoid was no longer an abstract possibility. Ordinary farmers, craftsmen, and local militia had exchanged gunfire with British regulars. Whatever political disagreements remained inside, Congress suddenly acquired painful urgency. Delegates understood that history had crossed an invisible threshold. Decisions postponed yesterday could no longer wait. Events themselves had begun moving faster than debate. Among the most pressing questions facing Congress was leadership. If armed resistance continued, colonial forces would require a commander capable of uniting volunteers drawn from every colony rather than serving only local interests. John Adams believed one man stood above all others. George Washington possessed military experience, personal dignity, and perhaps most importantly, the trust of both northern and southern colonies. Selecting him would demonstrate that the struggle belonged to every colony equally, rather than remaining only a New England rebellion. When John proposed George Washington as commander-in-chief, the recommendation reflected remarkable political wisdom. He understood that victory required more than courage on the battlefield. It demanded unity among colonies that still viewed themselves as separate communities with distinct identities. Washington's appointment carried powerful symbolic meaning. Leadership would not belong exclusively to Massachusetts, despite the fighting beginning there. Instead, every colony would share responsibility for whatever future emerged from the growing conflict. Washington accepted the responsibility with characteristic humility, fully aware that success remained far from guaranteed. As he prepared to leave Philadelphia for the army gathering around Boston, John watched another chapter of history quietly begin. Neither man could foresee the years of hardship waiting ahead. Hunger, defeat, freezing winters, political division, financial crisis, and constant uncertainty would test both soldiers and civilians alike. Yet despite those unknown dangers, each continued forward, because turning back no longer seemed morally possible. even after open fighting had begun. Many delegates still hesitated before embracing complete independence. They feared foreign invasion, economic collapse, and civil war. John respected those concerns, but he increasingly believed history sometimes reaches moments when hesitation becomes more dangerous than decisive action. Liberty could not survive forever beneath divided intentions. Eventually, the colonies would have to decide whether they considered themselves loyal subjects seeking reform or a people determined to govern themselves regardless of the cost. Inside Congress, that debate intensified with every passing week. Conversations stretched deep into the night. Friendships endured severe strain. Tempers occasionally flared. No one enjoyed carrying such enormous responsibility. Every delegate understood that a single vote might influence generations yet unborn. The burden weighed heavily upon thoughtful men precisely because they recognized the magnitude of what stood before them. Contrary to later legend, independence was not born from excitement alone. It emerged through fear, doubt, sacrifice, and relentless determination. John Adams found himself working harder than ever before. Committee meetings filled his days, correspondence consumed his evenings. Speeches demanded careful preparation. Political negotiations required patience that often seemed impossible to maintain. Exhaustion became familiar, yet purpose carried him forward. Somewhere beneath endless discussion, he sensed that history was approaching one decisive moment. Soon the colonies would need more than complaints against injustice. They would need the courage to declare openly that they intended to become something entirely new. When that moment finally arrived, John Adams would stand among the voices urging his fellow delegates not to retreat from the future that was already calling their names. By the summer of 1776, the atmosphere inside Philadelphia had changed completely. Months earlier, many delegates still searched for compromise, hoping that reason might preserve both peace and liberty. Now those hopes had become increasingly fragile. Every report arriving from the colonies carried news of fresh conflict, deeper division, and growing sacrifice. Villages mourned the dead. Soldiers struggled with shortages. Families lived beneath constant uncertainty. And the question before Congress was no longer whether the relationship with Great Britain had been damaged. The real question was whether it could ever be repaired. For John Adams, the answer had become painfully clear. He believed history had reached a point where hesitation itself threatened the future. Independence was no longer a reckless dream imagined by a handful of idealists. It had become, in his mind, the only honest response to events already unfolding across the colonies. Yet believing something privately was very different from persuading an entire Congress to embrace the same conclusion. Many respected delegates remained cautious, fearing that one declaration might condemn millions to endless war and unimaginable hardship. The debates that followed were among the most intense ever witnessed in colonial America. Every speech carried enormous weight because every sentence might influence lives far beyond the walls of the meeting chamber. Some delegates warned that independence would provoke overwhelming military retaliation from Britain. Others questioned whether 13 colonies with different cultures and competing interests could truly survive as a single nation. Doubts filled the room as naturally as hope. No one possessed certainty. Everyone understood the consequences of failure would be devastating. John Adams became one of the strongest voices urging immediate action. Unlike fiery speakers who relied upon dramatic emotion, he built his arguments patiently, guiding listeners through logic rather than excitement. He reminded fellow delegates that history rarely offered perfect moments for courageous decisions. Waiting for complete safety meant waiting forever. Governments founded upon liberty could not grow beneath endless hesitation. Every additional month of uncertainty weakened public confidence while strengthening confusion. Eventually, someone would need to choose conviction over comfort. His speeches were not polished performances designed to entertain. Witnesses often described them as intense, direct, and filled with relentless reasoning. John spoke with the urgency of a man who believed delay itself carried moral consequences. He understood that many colleagues disagreed sincerely, not from cowardice but from genuine concern for their families and communities. Rather than mocking those fears, he addressed them carefully. True leadership, he believed, required persuading thoughtful people rather than merely exciting those already convinced. Among all the delegates, one figure possessed extraordinary talent for expressing ideas through beautiful language. Thomas Jefferson, younger than John and naturally gifted with the written word, had earned widespread admiration for his elegant style. While John excelled in debate and political strategy, Jefferson possessed the rare ability to transform complicated principles into sentences that ordinary people could remember for generations. Recognizing this gift, John strongly encouraged him to draft the declaration that would soon become one of history's most influential documents. Years later, people often imagined rivalry between these two remarkable men from the very beginning. The truth was far more human. During those crucial weeks, John admired Jefferson deeply. He understood that the success of the Declaration depended not only upon the justice of its ideas but also upon the power of its language. According to later accounts, Jefferson initially hesitated, believing someone else might perform the task more effectively. John refused to accept that hesitation. He insisted that Jefferson possessed exactly the voice the moment required. While Jefferson worked quietly on the first draft, committees met repeatedly to review language, refine arguments, and eliminate unnecessary divisions. Every paragraph received careful examination because every word mattered. The Declaration would not simply announce political separation. It would explain to the world why separation had become necessary. Future generations might judge the entire revolution through this single document. Therefore, precision mattered as much as passion. Lofty ideals needed clear reasoning capable of surviving both immediate criticism and the judgment of history. John participated actively throughout that process, suggesting revisions, defending essential ideas, and helping build support among delegates who remained uncertain. Much of his most important work occurred away from public speeches. Private conversations filled hallways, boarding houses, dining tables, and evening gatherings. One by one, hesitant delegates were encouraged, reassured, or challenged. Victories inside. Congress rarely depended upon dramatic moments alone. They emerged from countless quiet discussions where trust developed slowly through patience and persistence rather than applause. Finally, after days of revision and relentless debate, the decisive vote approached. Silence settled across the meeting chamber with unusual heaviness. Every delegate understood that once the decision was made, there would be no simple return to the old relationship with Britain. Signatures placed upon the Declaration might one day become evidence in trials for treason should the revolution fail. Wealth could be confiscated, families endangered, lives forfeited. Each man present understood that he was risking far more than political reputation. He was placing his future into uncertain hands. When the vote ultimately favored independence, relief mixed naturally with solemnity. Contrary to later legends, there was no explosion of wild celebration inside the chamber. Those present recognized the gravity of what they had done. They had declared themselves free, yet freedom remained only an aspiration, unless defended through years of sacrifice still waiting ahead. Joy existed, certainly, but it stood beside fear rather than replacing it. They had crossed a bridge that could never again be uncrossed. After the decision, John reportedly remarked that future generations would celebrate the day with fireworks, bells, festivals, music, and expressions of gratitude. In some respects, his prediction proved remarkably accurate. Every year, Americans would indeed gather to honor independence with public celebration. Yet even John could not fully imagine how deeply the Declaration would influence nations far beyond the American continent. Its principles would inspire reformers, revolutionaries, philosophers, and ordinary citizens across the world for centuries to come. The Declaration transformed John Adams from a respected colonial lawyer into one of the principal architects of a new republic. Nevertheless, he never viewed the document as the conclusion of their struggle. To him, it represented only the beginning. Words upon parchment could inspire hope, but they could not feed hungry soldiers, finance armies, negotiate foreign alliances, or survive invading forces. Every ideal proclaimed so confidently on paper would now face the harsh examination of reality. The revolution had entered its most dangerous chapter. Almost immediately, Congress turned its attention toward the overwhelming practical problems confronting the new nation. Supplies remained desperately scarce. The Continental Army lacked adequate clothing, food, weapons, and financial support. British forces possessed greater experience, stronger organization, and immense naval power. Many observers throughout Europe expected the rebellion to collapse within months. Confidence alone would never overcome such disadvantages. The colonies needed international recognition, diplomatic skill, and unwavering determination if independence were to become more than an inspiring declaration. John accepted committee assignments with tireless energy, often working from early morning until long after midnight. Fellow delegates frequently remarked that he seemed to serve on almost every important committee at once. Exhaustion became a constant companion, yet he rarely complained. He believed history demanded complete dedication from those fortunate enough to influence it. While others admired the dramatic language of the Declaration, John quietly devoted himself to the less glamorous labor required to transform ideals into functioning government. He understood something many people overlooked. Winning independence involved far more than defeating an army. It required building institutions strong enough to survive long after the generation of founders disappeared. Laws had to replace revolutionary enthusiasm. Stable government had to replace temporary cooperation. Public trust had to outlive charismatic leadership. These challenges interested John as deeply as military victory itself, because he believed lasting liberty depended upon disciplined institutions rather than emotional excitement alone. Before long, Congress would ask him to leave America once again, not as a lawyer or legislator, but as a diplomat crossing dangerous oceans in search of allies whose support might determine whether the fragile republic lived or died. The battlefield would soon extend beyond muskets and cannons into royal courts, negotiation tables, and the complicated world of international politics. There, John Adams would discover that winning peace could prove every bit as difficult as declaring independence in the first place. Leaving America for Europe required a different kind of courage than standing before Congress or speaking inside crowded meeting halls. On the battlefield, danger often announced itself openly through the sound of cannon fire and marching soldiers. Diplomacy was quieter, yet no less dangerous. A poorly chosen sentence could cost more lives than a lost battle. A failed negotiation might prolong war for years. When John Adams accepted the responsibility of representing the struggling United States overseas, he understood that the fate of the revolution would depend not only upon soldiers but also upon words. The voyage across the Atlantic was long, exhausting, and uncertain. Storms frequently battered fragile wooden ships, tossing passengers from one side of cramped cabins to the other. Violent winds could delay progress for weeks, while the constant threat of British warships forced captains to remain alert day and night. Travelers endured damp quarters, poor food, and endless stretches of empty ocean that seemed to erase every familiar landmark from memory. Each sunrise revealed only water. Each sunset reminded everyone how far they remained from home. John was not traveling for comfort or personal adventure. Every mile carried him farther away from Abigail, his children, and the familiar landscapes that had shaped his entire life. Letters required months to cross the ocean, and many never arrived at all. There were long periods when husband and wife simply hoped the other remained alive. Modern generations can scarcely imagine such separation. Today, distance often lasts only hours. In the 18th century, distance demanded patience measured not in days but in seasons. Despite the loneliness, John remained committed to the mission before him. The United States desperately needed foreign recognition, financial assistance, military cooperation, and international legitimacy. Without allies, the colonies faced overwhelming odds against the British Empire. Every successful negotiation increased the chances that the revolution might survive. Every diplomatic failure strengthened Britain's position. John carried these realities with him during every conversation, every formal meeting, and every carefully written letter sent back across the Atlantic. Europe presented an entirely different political world from the rough simplicity of colonial America. Royal courts moved according to elaborate traditions developed over centuries. Titles, ceremonies, formal etiquette, and subtle customs shaped almost every interaction. Experienced diplomats often communicated as much through silence and timing as through spoken words. John admired neither unnecessary ceremony nor artificial politeness. He valued directness. This difference occasionally created tension because European officials sometimes mistook honesty for impatience and simplicity for lack of sophistication. Among all the countries observing the American struggle, France held special importance. French leaders recognized an opportunity to weaken their longtime rival, Great Britain, by supporting the rebellious colonies. Yet sympathy alone would never determine foreign policy. Governments acted according to national interests rather than sentiment. John clearly understood this reality. Although grateful for assistance, he refused to confuse friendship with permanent loyalty. Every alliance required careful negotiation because political interests changed as quickly as circumstances themselves. During these years abroad, John met remarkable statesmen, ambassadors, merchants, philosophers, and military leaders from across Europe. Conversations frequently extended far beyond questions of war. They explored commerce, government, religion, education, and the future of republican ideas. Many European observers regarded the American experiment with curiosity mixed with skepticism. Some admired the colonists' determination. Others quietly predicted inevitable failure. Republics, they believed, rarely survived internal disagreement for very long. John found himself defending not only American independence but the very possibility that ordinary citizens could successfully govern themselves. His straightforward personality occasionally created friction, even among fellow American representatives. Benjamin Franklin, serving in France, possessed extraordinary charm and remarkable social skill. Where Franklin won hearts through wit and graceful conversation, John preferred careful reasoning and blunt honesty. The two men respected one another, yet their methods differed greatly. Observers often compared them. Though comparison missed an important truth, successful diplomacy required many different personalities. Franklin opened doors with effortless elegance. John walked through those doors carrying detailed arguments that refused to compromise essential principles. While political negotiations consumed his public life, private loneliness continued quietly in the background. Evenings often ended with John writing letters to Abigail beneath candlelight. Those letters reveal a man far removed from the confident statesman described in history books. He spoke of missing home, worrying about family, growing weary of endless negotiations, and longing for ordinary conversations around his own table. Public responsibility demanded constant strength, yet private correspondence allowed him to acknowledge the emotional cost that responsibility required. Abigail's replies crossed the ocean whenever weather, war, and fortune allowed. She described life on the family farm, the challenges of raising children during uncertain times, shortages caused by conflict, and the quiet resilience ordinary Americans displayed each day. Her letters reminded John why every difficult negotiation mattered. Behind political debates stood countless families, hoping simply to live in peace, raise their children with dignity, and build futures free from fear. Those ordinary lives gave meaning to every diplomatic struggle. Eventually, John traveled to the Dutch Republic, where another difficult challenge awaited him. The United States desperately needed loans to finance the continuing war, Yet convincing cautious bankers to invest in an uncertain revolution proved extraordinarily difficult. Financial institutions trusted stability, and the American cause appeared anything but stable. Military victories remained uncertain. Government structures were still developing. Repayment seemed far from guaranteed. Persuading investors demanded persistence equal to anything John had displayed inside Congress or the courtroom. Day after day, meeting after meeting, he patiently presented the American case. He argued that the new nation possessed not only determination but also economic potential worthy of international confidence. Progress came slowly. There were moments when rejection appeared almost inevitable. Many diplomats might have surrendered beneath such discouragement. John simply continued working. He believed persistence often achieved what brilliance alone could never accomplish. Eventually, his efforts succeeded. Dutch financial support became an important lifeline for the struggling republic. Perhaps his greatest diplomatic achievement came near the end of the Revolutionary War. Representatives from the United States and Great Britain gathered to negotiate terms that would finally bring years of bloodshed toward conclusion. Every sentence carried enormous significance because peace agreements shaped generations long after armies lay down their weapons. John entered those negotiations determined that America would receive recognition as a fully independent nation, rather than a rebellious colony granted temporary concessions. The discussions demanded extraordinary patience. Experienced negotiators tested one another constantly, searching for weaknesses that might produce favorable compromises. John refused to surrender essential principles merely for the appearance of quick agreement. He understood that future generations would inherit whatever settlement emerged from those conversations. Temporary convenience could not justify permanent disadvantage. His firmness occasionally frustrated allies, as well as opponents, yet history would later demonstrate the lasting value of his determination. When the Treaty of Paris was finally completed, Great Britain formally recognized the independence of the United States. After years of sacrifice, uncertainty, and relentless effort, the revolution had achieved international legitimacy. For John Adams, the moment carried deep personal meaning. He had devoted countless hours, crossed dangerous oceans, endured painful separation from family, and faced repeated disappointment without ever abandoning the belief that liberty deserved every sacrifice required to preserve it. Yet even this remarkable success did not satisfy his sense of duty. Many people might have considered such achievements sufficient for a lifetime. John saw them only as another chapter in an unfinished story. The United States remained fragile. Peace created opportunities, but it also introduced entirely new challenges. Building a stable republic would demand wisdom equal to that required during war. Before long, John Adams would once again return home, where another unexpected responsibility awaited him. George Washington would become the first president of the United States, and the nation would soon ask John to stand beside him as its very first vice president, helping shape a government unlike any the modern world had ever known. Returning to the United States after years abroad felt strangely unfamiliar. The land was the same, yet the nation had changed beyond recognition. The colonies he had left behind no longer existed. In their place stood a fragile republic struggling to transform revolutionary ideals into everyday reality. Independence had been won, but victory on the battlefield solved only part of the problem. Now came the far more difficult challenge of proving that free people could successfully govern themselves without descending into chaos or tyranny. When George Washington accepted the office of the first president, the entire country looked toward him with extraordinary hope. His reputation united citizens who often disagreed about nearly everything else. Beside him stood John Adams, elected as the first vice president of the United States. Although history remembers the presidency far more vividly, no one truly knew what the office of vice president was supposed to become. The Constitution offered only limited guidance, leaving John to discover the role while simultaneously helping shape the government itself. From the very beginning, he found the position frustrating. John possessed a restless mind, One accustomed to solving problems and participating directly in major decisions, yet the office offered surprisingly little executive authority. Most of his official duties centered upon presiding over debates in the Senate and casting a vote only when members were equally divided. For a man who had spent years negotiating treaties, defending independence, and helping build a nation, the position often felt strangely passive. He once remarked with characteristic honesty that it was the most insignificant office ever invented by human imagination. Despite his private frustrations, John refused to neglect his responsibilities. He believed that institutions became respected only when the people serving them performed their duties with seriousness, regardless of personal satisfaction. Every procedure, every precedent, and every constitutional custom established during those early years might influence future generations. Therefore, even seemingly minor decisions deserved careful attention. The Republic remained young enough that habits formed in its infancy could easily become permanent features of its political character. Working beside George Washington also provided valuable lessons in leadership. The two men differed in personality yet shared deep respect for public duty. Washington possessed extraordinary calm, speaking only after careful reflection. His presence alone often settled heated disagreements before they grew dangerous. John admired that quiet authority even when he occasionally wished decisions moved more quickly. Observing Washington closely allowed him to appreciate that strength sometimes revealed itself through patience rather than urgency, through restraint rather than constant action. Although the new government gradually found stability, political disagreements began emerging with increasing intensity. Many leaders believed the federal government required greater authority to protect national unity and economic growth. Others feared concentrated power would eventually resemble the very system the revolution had rejected. These differences produced the first organized political parties in American history. Friendships strained beneath ideological conflict. Newspapers became increasingly partisan. Public debate often grew sharper than anyone had anticipated during the hopeful days following independence. John found himself associated with the Federalists, who generally favored a stronger national government, capable of maintaining order and encouraging economic development. Opposite them stood the Democratic Republicans, led largely by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who believed individual states should retain greater independence from federal authority. The disagreements extended far beyond technical questions of government. They reflected competing visions of what America should become. Each side believed it defended liberty, yet each defined liberty differently. The growing political rivalry between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson surprised many people who remembered their earlier cooperation during the Revolution. Once they had stood together advocating independence, now newspapers portrayed them as symbols of opposing futures. Disagreements that had once remained respectful gradually hardened into public conflict. Supporters on both sides intensified divisions through relentless criticism, often portraying political opponents not simply as mistaken but as dangerous threats to the nation's survival. American politics had entered a far more confrontational era. Throughout these years, Washington repeatedly expressed his desire to retire. After carrying the burdens of leadership through war and the difficult early years of government, he longed to return permanently to Mount Vernon. Many citizens begged him to remain, believing no one else possessed sufficient authority to preserve national unity. Eventually, however, Washington concluded that peaceful transfer of power represented one of the greatest gifts he could leave the Republic. No government should depend forever upon a single extraordinary individual. The presidential election that followed proved deeply divisive. Unlike later campaigns filled with organized national structures, early elections unfolded through personal letters, newspaper essays, and political alliances that shifted constantly. Criticism became increasingly personal. Opponents questioned motives as often as policies. John watched with growing concern as public discussion sometimes abandoned careful reasoning in favor of emotional accusation. Although he accepted vigorous debate as essential to Republican government, He worried that bitterness might eventually weaken the very nation everyone claimed to defend. When the electoral votes were finally counted, John Adams became the second president of the United States. The victory brought satisfaction mixed with enormous responsibility. No longer could he advise from beside the president. Every important decision would now carry his own signature. Even more remarkably, the constitutional system produced an unexpected arrangement. Under the election rules then in place, Thomas Jefferson, his principal political rival, became vice president. Two men representing increasingly different visions of America would now serve within the same administration. John entered the presidency during one of the most dangerous periods the young republic had yet faced. Europe had descended into conflict following the French Revolution. Great Britain and France competed fiercely for influence across the Atlantic, each expecting the United States to favor its interests. American merchant ships suffered interference from both sides. Public opinion fractured dramatically. Some citizens sympathized with France because of its assistance during the Revolutionary War. Others believed closer ties with Britain better served national prosperity and security. Many voices demanded immediate military action whenever foreign governments insulted American interests. John understood the emotional appeal of such calls, yet he also recognized the terrifying reality of war. The United States remained economically fragile, militarily limited, and politically divided. Another major conflict could destroy everything the revolution had achieved. Preserving peace therefore became one of his highest priorities, even when peace required enduring criticism from citizens who mistook restraint for weakness. His commitment to avoiding unnecessary war soon faced its greatest test during the diplomatic crisis that became known as the XYZ affair. American envoys sent to negotiate with France encountered unofficial demands for bribes before formal discussions could even begin. When news reached the United States, public outrage exploded. Newspapers called for retaliation. Political opponents accused France of humiliating the Republic. Crowds demanded decisive action. Many believed armed conflict had become unavoidable. John responded with remarkable self-control. While strengthening national defenses and preparing for possible conflict, he refused to surrender diplomacy entirely. He believed a responsible president must distinguish between wounded pride and genuine national necessity. War should become the final option rather than the first emotional reaction. This balanced approach angered extremists on both sides. Some accused him of excessive caution. Others feared he had already gone too far. Leadership, he discovered once again, often required disappointing people whose approval could never be permanently secured. History would later judge this decision among the wisest of his presidency. By resisting overwhelming pressure for immediate war, John helped spare the young nation from a conflict it was poorly prepared to fight. The choice brought little political reward at the time. Many contemporaries misunderstood his motives, yet he remained guided by the same principle that had shaped his entire career since defending the British soldiers in Boston decades earlier. Popularity fades quickly. Duty endures. Sometimes the hardest decisions are precisely those future generations appreciate most, even while the present generation condemns them. Although history would later recognize John Adams for preserving peace, the political climate surrounding his presidency grew increasingly hostile. Every decision seemed to divide rather than unite. Newspapers published relentless attacks upon his character. Political opponents portrayed him as dangerously ambitious, while some former allies complained that he was too cautious when bold action appeared necessary. Criticism followed him almost everywhere. Unlike George Washington, whose reputation often rose above partisan conflict, John found himself standing directly in the center of an increasingly bitter political storm. The rise of organized political parties transformed public life in ways few of the founders had anticipated. During the Revolution, disagreements certainly existed, yet most leaders remained united by the common goal of independence. Now independence had already been secured, leaving room for competing visions of how the Republic should develop. Newspapers openly supported one political faction or another. Editors no longer claimed complete neutrality. Instead, they praised allies enthusiastically while condemning opponents with language that often seemed harsher than modern readers might expect. John struggled with this new political reality. Throughout his life, he had believed that public service demanded honesty, even when honesty proved unpopular. He rarely adjusted his opinions simply to satisfy changing public moods. Unfortunately, such independence often carried a heavy political cost. Supporters occasionally wished he would speak more diplomatically. Opponents interpreted his bluntness as arrogance. His refusal to flatter powerful interests earned admiration from some citizens but deep resentment from others. The qualities that had built his reputation gradually became sources of controversy during his presidency. One of the most debated episodes of his administration involved the Alien and Sedition Acts. Supporters argued that the young republic faced serious threats from foreign influence and domestic unrest, particularly as tensions with France continued. They believed stronger legal protections would preserve national stability during uncertain times. Critics, however, feared the legislation granted excessive power to the federal government and threatened the freedoms that the revolution itself had been fought to protect. The controversy quickly spread across the entire nation. John believed he was acting in the country's best interest by supporting measures designed to strengthen security during a dangerous period. Nevertheless, many citizens viewed the laws quite differently. Newspaper editors condemned them as attacks upon free expression. Political opponents claimed the government was silencing criticism rather than defending liberty. Whether fair or unfair, these accusations significantly damaged public confidence in his administration. Even today, historians continue debating the necessity and long-term consequences of those decisions. What makes this chapter particularly fascinating is that John never considered himself an enemy of liberty, quite the opposite. He had devoted decades of his life to defending constitutional government and the rule of law. From his perspective, preserving order remained essential if freedom itself were to survive. Without stability, he feared that Republican government might collapse into violence or dictatorship. Yet history repeatedly reminds us that sincere people can disagree profoundly about how liberty should be protected. The disagreements surrounding these laws reflected exactly that difficult tension. While political arguments intensified at home, John continued pursuing one objective that remained more important to him than personal popularity. He wanted to keep the United States out of another devastating war. Despite fierce criticism from members of his own political party, he reopened diplomatic negotiations with France. Many Federalists considered this decision dangerously naive. They believed military confrontation had become inevitable. John refused to accept that conclusion. Without exhausting every peaceful alternative, he understood too well the human cost hidden behind every declaration of war. His persistence eventually produced results. Negotiations succeeded in easing tensions between the two nations, avoiding a large-scale conflict that many observers had considered unavoidable only months earlier. Remarkably, one of the greatest achievements of his presidency became one of the least appreciated during his own lifetime. Because war never fully erupted, many citizens failed to recognize how close the country had come to disaster. Success often appears invisible when it prevents tragedies that never happen. Peace rarely creates the dramatic memories that victory in battle leaves behind. As another presidential election approached, the political atmosphere grew even more divisive. Personal attacks overshadowed serious discussion of national policy. Newspapers exaggerated rumors, questioned motives, and encouraged citizens to view political opponents with increasing suspicion. John watched these developments with disappointment. He had hoped the Republic would become an example of reasoned self-government. Instead, he witnessed growing hostility that sometimes seemed to value party loyalty above national unity. The divisions troubled him deeply because he feared they threatened the long-term health of the constitutional system. The election of 1800 became one of the most significant turning points in American political history. After months of intense campaigning, The results brought defeat for John Adams and victory for Thomas Jefferson, the man who had once stood beside him during the struggle for independence. The irony was impossible to ignore. Two former friends, later fierce political rivals, now exchanged the highest office in the nation through constitutional process rather than violence. Despite personal disappointment, John accepted the outcome peacefully, setting another important precedent for future generations. On the morning he prepared to leave the presidential residence, there was no grand celebration marking the end of his administration. He packed his belongings quietly and departed before Jefferson's inauguration. Historians have debated that decision for generations. Some interpreted it as evidence of lingering resentment. Others believed he simply wished to avoid unnecessary public attention during an emotionally difficult moment. Whatever his reasons, the departure reflected a man carrying both pride and disappointment after decades devoted almost entirely to public service. Returning once again to private life, John faced a painful question familiar to many leaders throughout history. How would posterity remember him? Would future generations recall only political controversies and electoral defeat? Would they overlook the sacrifices, difficult decisions, and quiet acts of courage that had shaped the nation's earliest years? Unlike Washington, whose reputation seemed secure, John could not know whether history would judge him kindly. He entered retirement carrying uncertainties that no public honor could completely erase. Yet retirement also offered something precious that years of public life had often denied him: time with Abigail. After decades separated by politics, diplomacy, and war, husband and wife once again shared ordinary routines beneath the same roof. They walked together, discussed books, reflected upon changing events, and welcomed visits from children and grandchildren. The frantic pace of government slowly gave way to quieter rhythms. Although advancing age brought physical limitations, it also allowed deeper appreciation for simple moments that ambition had once forced them to postpone. Still, one absence remained impossible to ignore. Communication between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson had completely ceased. The friendship that once helped shape a revolution appeared permanently broken by years of political rivalry and personal misunderstanding. For more than a decade, silence stretched between two men who had changed history together. Few people believed reconciliation remained possible. Yet time possesses a remarkable ability to soften wounds that pride alone cannot heal. Before many more years passed, an unexpected letter would begin one of the greatest correspondences in American history, proving that even the deepest divisions can sometimes yield to wisdom, memory, and the quiet humility that often arrives only with old age. The years that followed unfolded with a slower rhythm than anything John Adams had experienced since his youth. For the first time in decades, mornings no longer began with urgent political meetings, diplomatic correspondence, or the weight of national decisions resting upon his shoulders. Instead, they began with quiet walks across familiar fields, conversations with Abigail over simple meals, and long hours spent reading beside the window. After a lifetime devoted almost entirely to public service, retirement invited him back into the ordinary world he had left behind many years earlier. Yet peace did not erase reflection. As age advanced, John found himself looking backward more often than forward. Memories arrived without invitation. He remembered the muddy roads of Braintree, the long evenings studying by candlelight, the crowded halls of Congress, the endless ocean crossings, and the exhausting debates that had shaped the birth of a nation. Each memory carried both pride and regret. He understood better than anyone that history rarely belongs to perfect people. It belongs to imperfect men and women who continue moving forward despite uncertainty, fear, and countless mistakes. Among all those memories, one absence remained especially painful. Communication between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson had ended years earlier. Once they had worked side by side in pursuit of independence. Later they had become fierce political opponents whose disagreements divided not only Congress but much of the young republic itself. Words spoken in anger, articles published in partisan newspapers, and years of political rivalry had gradually built a wall of silence between two men who once trusted each other deeply. Many believed that silence would last until death. The unexpected beginning of reconciliation came through the encouragement of mutual friends who understood how much history had lost by separating these two remarkable minds. Eventually, after years without meaningful contact, a letter crossed the distance between Massachusetts and Virginia. It was neither dramatic nor sentimental. Instead, it was cautious, respectful, and deeply human. Neither man attempted to erase the past. Neither demanded apology before conversation could begin again. They simply chose to speak, allowing honesty to replace pride one careful sentence at a time. What followed became one of the greatest exchanges of letters in American history. Over the course of many years, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson wrote to one another with extraordinary openness. Politics certainly appeared in their correspondence, yet it no longer dominated every discussion. Instead, they reflected upon philosophy, religion, education, human nature, aging, and the uncertain future awaiting the republic they had helped create. The rivalry that once defined their relationship gradually gave way to something quieter and perhaps even more meaningful, mutual understanding earned through shared experience. Reading those letters today reveals two elderly men no longer trying to defeat one another. They had reached an age where victory seemed far less important than truth. They questioned old assumptions, admitted personal mistakes, laughed about youthful ambition, and wondered how future generations might judge their decisions. There is remarkable humility within those conversations. Neither claimed perfect wisdom. Both recognized how often history forces leaders to choose between imperfect options rather than ideal solutions. Age had softened, certainty without diminishing conviction. Abigail remained the steady center of John's life throughout these peaceful years. After decades of separation caused by diplomacy, politics, and war, husband and wife finally enjoyed the ordinary companionship they had sacrificed for so long. They discussed books, welcomed visitors, observed grandchildren growing older, and reflected together upon the astonishing transformation they had witnessed. America had evolved from scattered colonies into an independent republic. Much remained unfinished. Yet they could see with quiet satisfaction that the constitutional experiment had survived challenges once thought impossible. Then sorrow entered their home once more. In 1818, Abigail passed away after more than half a century of marriage. For John, the loss reached beyond grief itself. She had not simply been his wife. She had been his closest advisor, his strongest critic, his greatest source of emotional strength, and the one person who understood every chapter of his extraordinary life because she had lived through nearly all of them beside him. After her death, the farmhouse felt larger, quieter, and profoundly empty in ways no public honor could ever fill. Despite deep loneliness, John continued writing. His correspondence with Jefferson became even more meaningful because it connected him with another person who fully understood the burdens carried by their generation. Both men had buried loved ones. Both had endured political triumphs and humiliations. Both watched younger generations inherit responsibilities they themselves had once carried. Their letters increasingly resembled conversations between old travelers, resting together after completing a difficult journey. There was little left to prove. There remained only the desire to understand life before it reached its final chapter. As the years advanced into the 1820s, John's physical strength gradually declined. Though his mind retained remarkable clarity, visitors often found him eager to discuss ancient history, literature, philosophy, or current events with undiminished curiosity. He followed national affairs closely, observing how the Republic continued changing long after his own active role had ended. Younger politicians now shaped debates once led by revolutionary figures. America belonged increasingly to a new generation, exactly as he had always hoped it eventually would. There was quiet satisfaction in witnessing peaceful transfers of power continue from one administration to another. When the Constitution had first been written, no one could guarantee that ambitious leaders would willingly surrender authority after elections. Yet year after year, the Republic demonstrated that government could change hands without civil war or dictatorship. John regarded this achievement as one of the greatest validations of everything his generation had struggled to build. Institutions, not individuals, had become the true guardians of American liberty. Still, advancing age brought inevitable reminders that time allows no exceptions. Old friends disappeared one by one. Familiar voices fell silent. The revolutionary generation steadily passed into memory. Visitors increasingly sought John not merely as a respected elder, but as one of the last surviving witnesses to events that younger Americans already regarded as distant history. He answered their questions patiently, often emphasizing that independence had never been inevitable. It had depended upon countless ordinary sacrifices made by people whose names would never appear inside history books. During these final years, John rarely portrayed himself as a flawless hero. Instead, he spoke honestly about uncertainty, disagreement, and human weakness. He understood that future generations might be tempted to imagine the founders as figures carved from marble rather than flesh and blood. Nothing could have been farther from the truth. They argued constantly. They doubted themselves. They feared failure. They disagreed over principles they all considered sacred. Yet despite those imperfections, they continued working together whenever the survival of the nation demanded cooperation above personal pride. Perhaps that honesty explains why John Adams continues speaking so powerfully across the centuries. His life does not resemble a perfect legend. It resembles the complicated journey of an ordinary human being entrusted with extraordinary responsibilities. He stumbled, learned, succeeded, failed, reconciled, persevered, and continued growing even in old age. The greatness history eventually recognized did not arise from perfection. It emerged from unwavering commitment to duty, despite personal flaws and relentless criticism. That quiet truth prepared the way for the final chapter of a remarkable life, one that would unfold on a summer day whose extraordinary coincidence would forever become part of the American story. The summer of 1826 arrived quietly in Quincy, Massachusetts. John Adams had lived long enough to witness something almost unimaginable. The fragile republic that had once existed only as an uncertain hope had reached its 50th year. Children had grown into adults knowing no king but the Constitution. Towns that had once feared invasion now celebrated peace. Roads that once carried exhausted soldiers now welcomed merchants, families, and travelers moving freely through an independent nation. The experiment that so many had believed impossible was no longer merely surviving. It was beginning to mature. Age, however, had gradually claimed the strength that had carried him through decades of public service. Walking required greater effort. Reading often demanded longer periods of rest. Conversations that once lasted deep into the night now ended much earlier than before. Yet visitors continued arriving from across the country, hoping to meet one of the last living founders of the United States. They expected to encounter a legend. Instead, they found an elderly man whose greatest qualities remained humility, curiosity, and an undiminished love of thoughtful conversation. Those who sat beside him rarely heard endless stories celebrating his own achievements. Instead, John spoke about responsibility. He reminded younger generations that independence had never been the work of one extraordinary individual. Farmers, merchants, mothers, teachers, soldiers, sailors, ministers, craftsmen, and countless unnamed citizens had carried the revolution together. History often remembers only a handful of famous names, yet every great nation is built upon millions of ordinary people who quietly fulfill their duties without expecting monuments in return. His correspondence with Thomas Jefferson continued until the very end of their lives. The letters grew increasingly reflective, almost meditative. They discussed old age with remarkable honesty, acknowledging how memory changes as years accumulate. Victories appeared less important than character. Political arguments that once seemed overwhelming gradually faded beside larger questions about faith, humanity, education, and the future of civilization itself. Reading their final exchanges today feels less like observing two former presidents and more like listening to lifelong students searching together for wisdom before time finally called them home. As July approached, preparations for the 50th anniversary of American independence spread throughout the nation. Communities planned speeches, parades, public dinners, church services, and celebrations honoring the remarkable journey from colony to republic. Few citizens realized that while they organized festivities, two elderly men separated by hundreds of kilometers were quietly approaching the final chapter of their own stories. Neither John Adams in Massachusetts nor Thomas Jefferson in Virginia fully understood how closely history had once again woven their lives together. During the morning of July 4th, John's condition became noticeably weaker. Family members gathered nearby, recognizing that the end might be close. Despite physical exhaustion, moments of awareness still returned. At one point he quietly whispered the words that would become forever associated with his final hours. "Thomas Jefferson survives." The sentence reflected affection more than politics. After everything they had shared, friendship remained stronger than rivalry. What John could not know was that Jefferson had already passed away earlier that same day at Monticello, only hours before those final words were spoken. The coincidence stunned the nation. When news eventually spread, two principal architects of American independence had died on the exact 50th anniversary of the declaration that forever united their names. Many citizens struggled to accept the reality. The timing appeared almost too meaningful for ordinary history. Writers described it as providence. Ministers called it divine symbolism. Ordinary people simply stood in silent amazement. Whether viewed through faith, coincidence, or poetic destiny, the event became one of the most unforgettable moments in the story of the United States. John Adams passed away peacefully that evening, leaving behind not only public achievements but also an enduring example of principled service. Unlike many leaders remembered primarily for victory, he came to symbolize something quieter and perhaps even more difficult. He demonstrated that integrity sometimes requires defending unpopular truths, accepting criticism without surrendering conviction, and placing long-term national welfare above immediate political advantage. These qualities rarely produce instant applause, yet they often become the foundations upon which lasting institutions are built. History eventually judged many of his decisions with greater generosity than his own generation had shown. Scholars recognize the importance of his defense of legal fairness during the Boston Massacre trial. Diplomats praised his persistence in securing international recognition for American independence. Political historians increasingly acknowledge that his determination to avoid unnecessary war with France preserved the young republic during one of its most vulnerable periods. Time accomplished what contemporary politics often could not. It separated temporary controversy from lasting contribution. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of John Adams's legacy is not that he helped create a nation, but that he never believed the nation should depend upon any single individual. Throughout his life, he insisted that laws must stand above personalities, institutions above ambition, and public duty above private glory. This belief shaped every chapter of his career. From the courtroom to Congress, from diplomatic negotiations to the presidency, he understood that truly successful leadership prepares a country to thrive even after its founders are gone. There is something deeply comforting about that idea in every generation. Modern life often celebrates individuals as though history changes through extraordinary heroes acting alone. John Adams's life suggests something different. Great change usually grows from ordinary habits practiced faithfully over many years. Honesty when dishonesty appears easier. Patience when frustration invites anger. Preparation before opportunity arrives. Courage expressed quietly rather than dramatically. These small choices accumulate until they become the character capable of meeting history when history unexpectedly comes knocking at the door. Today, visitors who walk through the peaceful streets of Quincy or stand inside the preserved rooms where John and Abigail once lived encounter no battlefield, no royal palace, and no monument proclaiming constant triumph. Instead, they discover the home of two thoughtful people who devoted themselves to ideas larger than personal success. The modest surroundings seem entirely appropriate. After all, the journey of John Adams began in simplicity, remained grounded in duty, and concluded with remarkable humility despite the extraordinary influence he ultimately exercised upon the modern world. Perhaps that is why his story continues, speaking across more than 2 centuries, not because he was flawless, but because he remained unmistakably human. He doubted, struggled, argued, failed, persevered, reconciled, loved deeply, and continued learning until the final days of his life. His greatness did not arise from perfection. It emerged from the quiet determination to keep serving principles he believed were worth defending, even when doing so demanded sacrifice that few people could fully understand. When the bells rang across America on that historic July afternoon, citizens celebrated 50 years of independence without realizing they were also saying farewell to one of its most steadfast guardians. The nation continued forward, just as John had always hoped it would, carried now by younger generations who inherited freedoms purchased through unimaginable effort. His voice fell silent, yet the institutions he helped build continued speaking through constitutions, courts, peaceful elections, and the enduring belief that liberty survives best when guided by justice, humility, and unwavering responsibility. The story of John Adams, therefore, does not truly end with his final breath. It continues wherever people choose principle over popularity, truth over convenience, and duty over personal ambition. Every generation faces different challenges, yet the quiet questions remain remarkably similar. What kind of nation will we leave behind? What sacrifices are worthy of the future? And when history eventually looks back upon our own lives, will it remember loud victories or the quiet courage with which ordinary people fulfilled extraordinary responsibilities? Perhaps John Adams answered those questions not through perfect words, but through the steady example of an entire lifetime faithfully lived.